next up is Stephanie Seneff, who is a research professor at MIT, who is basically in her second career as now a biologist after being an electrical engineering and computer scientist, and has made waves in the biological area as well, particularly studying glyphosate. She has written this book, Toxic Legacy, came out 3 years ago. Important book about glyphosate also. Stephanie, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. And Donna, it was a wonderful talk. I remember I heard a talk you gave back in Indianapolis, Indiana, 2012, 12 years ago. That changed my life. That was when I was trying to figure out what was causing the autism epidemic, and I was coming up short. And I knew that something was messing up the gut. And so then when I heard your talk, I was like, this is it. And I stopped everything else that I was doing and just went straight to glyphosate. And that's been my life since then. So I really appreciate that talk. And this was a wonderful talk again. I learned something new every time I hear you talk. So thank you so much. I will share my screen and get started with my slides. So this is the title of my talk, Glyphosate, Ecosystem, and Climate Change. This is different from what I usually talk about because I'm usually focused on human health. And many of you have probably heard my talks where I show all the different diseases, which of course, Dr. Huber also showed in his presentation, all the different diseases that it's causing in humans. Here I'm going to focus on climate change. So here's an outline, introduction, and then I'm going to talk about disruption of nitrogen and carbon fixation. And then I'm going to talk about cloud seeding and marine phytoplankton. That's something I only discovered recently, and I'm quite excited or disturbed by what I found on that topic as well. So just the introduction, and of course you know this now if you heard Dr. Huber's talk, glyphosate is now the #1 herbicide in use in the United States. It's increasingly being used around the world. Not only is it used on the GMO crops, but it's also used as a desiccant on non-GMO crops like wheat, sprayed right before harvest. And I think that's what's causing the epidemic in gluten intolerance and celiac disease. Patented by Monsanto in 1969 as an herbicide, introduced in the United States food chain in 1974. So it's been around for a very long time, but its usage really escalated once they introduced the GMO crops around the turn of the century. It inhibits the shikimate pathway, which is involved in the synthesis of these essential aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. And there was a huge expansion of GMO corn, soy, cotton, and canola crops, which has led to sharp increases over the past 2 decades. And here's a chart of glyphosate usage on corn and soy, which is the blue line. The red is the emergence of resistant weeds, and you can see they follow very closely. What happened was they didn't expect this, but many of the weeds became tolerant, and they had to use more and more glyphosate to kill them. Now they're running into problems where they have to actually put another chemical into the formulation because glyphosate is unable to kill some of these resistant weeds. So they're putting other things like dicamba and glyphosate and 2,4-D, which are supposedly much more toxic herbicides, into the formula to handle these resistant weeds. So it's increased usage over time, maybe in large part was due to the emergence of these resistant weeds. This is my book, Toxic Legacy. It was released by Chelsea Green in 2021, and it presents extensive data on glyphosate's toxicity to animals and humans with lots and lots of references. It shows how glyphosate interferes with sulfate homeostasis, which is something people are not aware of. And I believe that's one of its main problems with to produce autism is through the disruption of the sulfate system. And then this is very important here. I still believe this, and I have been the industry is resisting my idea, but I think it's true, and I still think it's true that glyphosate, it is an amino acid. It's an amino acid analog of glycine. It goes into proteins by mistake in place of glycine, and this is a major source of its trouble. It's why it can cause so many diseases. People say correlation doesn't mean causation, and they say, how could one chemical cause so many diseases? This is how it could, through this unique feature, which there's no other chemical that I know of in the world that can do this, substitute for glycine during protein synthesis. And in my book, I show how I connect the dots that this could explain all the different diseases that it's affecting. You can actually identify which protein is likely the source of trouble for that disease. So this book was selected by Kirkus Reviews as one of the top 100 nonfiction books of 2021. So here's the big picture with respect to my story today. Glyphosate disrupts many aspects of metabolism in plants, animals, microbes, and fungi. Um, they have to use more fertilizers because of the inefficient uptake of the fertilizers. So the nitrogen and the phosphorus, the bacteria that help the plant to pick up these nutrients are disturbed by glyphosate. And so you have to use more, and then it runs off and gets into the waterways, and it becomes a very big, nitrate in particular becomes a problem. Nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas that is induced by glyphosate. And then it also interferes with the capture of carbon in soil. And I think that's a major contributor to climate change because carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that we all talk about. Plants all over the world are soaking up that carbon and putting it into the soil as organic matter. When that process becomes less efficient, more carbon stays in the air. And then this very interesting topic here, marine phytoplankton that can seed cloud formation over the oceans. But glyphosate suppresses their growth. And that's the new topic that I'm talking about for the first time today. So glyphosate accumulates in biofilms. I was really struck by this paper published in 2021. They did an interesting study where they had murky water. So it had biomass in the water, and they put glyphosate into the water. And then they measured how much glyphosate was there. And they found, oh my God, it disappeared. Where did it go? They noticed all of a sudden there was much less in the water than they had put in. And what they found was that it was going directly into those biofilms, 2 to 4 orders of magnitude higher concentrations in the biofilms than there was in the surrounding water. So it appears to rapidly disappear, but that's an illusion. And then what happens is these animals that live in the biofilms eat the glyphosate. And in fact, things like manatees in Florida eat those biofilms, and they get lots of glyphosate from the waterways in Florida. And that's why the manatees are so sick. They're really having a lot of trouble with the manatees these days. They're having a lot of health issues. So we may be under-recognizing the potential ecological risk of contaminants like glyphosate that are concentrating in biofilms and subsequently being consumed. And that, of course, is going to go up the food chain. So now this was a paper that I found from 2020. So notice these papers are quite recent. So I'm really excited to see so many papers showing up in the last few years showing glyphosate's true colors. I think in the past they didn't bother to study glyphosate because they thought it was safe and they wouldn't find anything. So that's kind of a boring study. But now that they realize it's not safe, many more people are studying it. And I really appreciate that. This is water fleas. They're near the bottom of the food chain. All these other animals like tadpoles and salamanders, newts, aquatic insects, small fish feed on the water fleas. When these water fleas were exposed to concentrations of Roundup and glyphosate that were well below the approved regulatory threshold, they had all kinds of problems: embryonic developmental failure, systemic inflammation, collagen degradation. This one's very interesting to me because collagen has lots and lots of glycine, impaired wound healing, disrupted gut microbes. Don Huber talked about that. And I'm of course, very aware of that problem with respect to autism. These animals, the animals that eat these water fleas, concentrate glyphosate, and the animals that eat those animals, and it goes up the food chain, so that all the animals are being exposed to the glyphosate that was originally eaten by the water fleas. So now disrupted nitrogen and carbon fixation, my next topic. Agricultural runoff contributes to climate change. Nitrous oxide, this is very interesting. I learned this many years ago. With respect to glyphosate, nitrous oxide is much more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, 300 times the effect of the equivalent amount of nitrous oxide. And so the fertilizer that's put on the farm doesn't get taken up by the plants because glyphosate is disrupting that. So it gets washed off when there's rain, it gets washed off into the waterways. And then there are these nitrogen breathing microbes in the waterways that can turn that into nitrous oxide, which is a gas that goes up into the atmosphere, and then it's a greenhouse gas. So this is a very serious problem. And I suspect it's a bigger contributor to climate change than we appreciate. So here's how glyphosate can disrupt nitrogen fixation in plants. I have several papers quoting here. Mung beans were exposed to glyphosate, and it was shown that they had impaired nitrogen uptake in this first study from 2005. Nitrogen fixing bacteria have an enzyme called nitrogenase that can turn nitrogen into ammonia, and that's how the plants can take it up. That's an important step in taking it up. And glyphosate exposure at sublethal levels severely impaired nitrogenase activity. That's this paper here from 2006. Glyphosate inhibits phosphoenolpyruvate carboxylase, PEPC, which is an important enzyme in the plants, not only for nitrogen, but also for carbon. Both of those nutrients, the process of incorporating them into the plant is essential. This is an essential enzyme for that process. So here's more about phosphoenol pyruvate carboxylase. This is an interesting protein to me, and it fits my model of what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif, meaning that it has sensitivity to glycine substitution. So it's a ubiquitous enzyme in plants, and it's also present in many other species, archaea, cyanobacteria, and green algae. And it's an integral enzyme in photosynthesis, which is going to assimilate carbon dioxide into green plants. And it has a terminal sequence, QNTG, and this is glycine G, highly conserved across multiple phyla. So this G is very important to the animal that's using this enzyme. And glyphosate has been shown experimentally to suppress the activity of this enzyme, which makes sense to me because it's going to substitute for this terminal glycine and cause trouble. And in fact, a study showed that if you replace that terminal glycine with aspartate and glutamate are the two amino acids that I use as a model for glyphosate because they're very similar. They have the negative charge, they're bulky. They're a good model for glyphosate. So when you substitute glycine by aspartate, you get 1,000-fold decrease in the activity of this enzyme. I think you would have the same effect if you put glyphosate there instead of glycine. So that's what I think is happening. And here's just a paper that shows all these different species over here, their version of that enzyme. All of them have this sequence at the end with that terminal glycine. So they're very susceptible to glyphosate's mischief. And now here, glyphosate, this paper is very dense and full of information. Glyphosate excessive use chronically disrupts the shikimate pathway and can affect photosynthesis and yield in citrus trees. And I know Don Huber has talked about citrus drop as a pathogen, a problem that's facing the Florida citrus crops. And he's worked with farmers who have found that if they get rid of the glyphosate, they get rid of this problem, the citrus drop problem. This study was looking at the effect of glyphosate. They've exposed certain leaves to glyphosate, the source leaves, and then the glyphosate made its way into these target leaves that are the blue here, and it caused a lot of problems in metabolism in these plants, showing reduced photosynthesis, increased respiration, increased carbon drain, decreased capture of carbon into the plant and into the soil. And so, and then also they talked about a hidden phytotoxicity, decreased yield, inhibited growth, and inhibited fruit yield, all of these problems. And it's this net CO2 assimilation. This is the problem of causing too much carbon dioxide in the air because it's not being taken up by the plant. Study on the effects of glyphosate on glyphosate sensitive and glyphosate resistant soybean plants. This was a fun paper that looked at two kinds of soybean, those that had the GMO and those that were non-GMO. So the non-GMO soybeans rapidly inhibited leaf photosynthesis. So photosynthesis really is a problem when plants are exposed to glyphosate. A rapid, marked, and sustained inhibition of photosynthetic carbon dioxide assimilation in the glyphosate sensitive line. And then they increased glutathione synthesis, indicating they were coping with oxidative damage and they were increasing antioxidant defenses. The glyphosate resistant plants also had significantly reduced chlorophyll content, which in the leaves compared to the controls. And also the glyphosate was accumulating at very high levels in the leaves. And this is going to bode badly for foods that are being exposed to glyphosate. And again, they had increased oxidized glutathione and ascorbate. These are indicators of oxidative damage, antioxidant defenses. And this is the most important thing that I read from this paper. Rubisco expression was reduced by a factor of 25-fold decrease in rubisco. That is a very important point because rubisco is the most common enzyme on the planet, and it plays an essential role in photosynthesis. So I think this is another way in which we're going to get decreased carbon capture by these plants. My last topic, cloud seeding and marine phytoplankton. Dimethyl sulfide, a really fascinating molecule. It's got a sulfur in there, which always perks me up. It's a small sulfur-containing gas, and it plays a significant role in climate change. And so it decreases the amount of solar radiation that reaches the Earth's surface by virtue of inducing cloud formation. It goes up into the air and it gets into the clouds. It gets into the air and seeds clouds, makes clouds. And it's synthesized from a molecule called dimethyl sulfonylpropionate. That's a mouthful, DMSP. And these there are certain marine plankton that can make this, marine phytoplankton, in shallow ocean waters that make this DMSP, which then turns into DMS and which then seeds clouds. And in particular, there's an important microbe called Emiliania huxley, it's a little hard to pronounce. an important marine phytoplankton species that synthesizes this DMSP. So this was all very fascinating and new to me in recent, just the last few months. I found this paper, Differential Growth Responses of Marine Phytoplankton to Herbicide Glyphosate. This was published in 2016. And in particular, they found that this particular microbe, E. huxleyi, is very sensitive to glyphosate, and it has severe growth inhibition. And they exposed it to glyphosate at both 36 micromolar and 360 micromolar concentrations. And here's a plot over here of what happened. The controls are the white, and then you have these two different amounts of the black is the high level glyphosate exposure. You can see it completely wipes them out here. And so these microbes are very sensitive to glyphosate. When they get killed off, you can think about the waterways, like say Mississippi River flowing out into the Caribbean. All that glyphosate is coming in there and destroying the ability of these guys to make cloud cover because of being exposed to glyphosate. And so that's going to be a serious problem. I think it may be a major factor in climate change, because if we can't make clouds, the oceans are going to heat up. So in summary, glyphosate is pervasive in our environment, and it's a significant contributor to human health issues and harm to the ecosystem. It accumulates in biomass and it harms water fleas at the bottom of the food chain. It disturbs the nutrients in the soil, chelating minerals and interfering with nitrogen uptake and photosynthesis, potentially impacting climate change. Marine phytoplankton can seed clouds, but glyphosate interferes with that process. And we urgently need to drastically reduce the use of glyphosate on crops for the purpose of climate change, to solve, or potentially to reverse the climate change problem by simply going certified organic in our crops. And of course, it will also help human health as well through that same process. So that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much. Quite a mouthful. I could barely keep up. Obviously, glyphosate is no good for anything. Well, it may be good actually if you stop using it the way we're using it now and you kept it for only certain things. It might be a useful antibiotic for certain resistant organisms. Who knows? But clearly a huge problem.